Okay, so welcome. Thank you so much for coming along to support the session today. I'll let Will introduce himself, but I just want to, before we start, give a little shout out to our next learning and teaching webinar in January in the new year with Dr. Ivana Listiakova, Dr. Wendy Lecluse and Caroline Lida on the 12th of January. And I will pop the link for the next webinar in the chat once I've stopped talking. And we are due to finish today at 5 o'clock. So feel free to use the Q&A to ask any questions, or the chat where I'll be monitoring that and picking up on your messages. So over to Will for today's session.
Thanks, Aisha. Hi, everyone. Really nice to be here. I said to Aisha that we've been in training most of the day, so well used to staring at my screen. Today what we're going to have a look at is games in the classroom, and really want to talk about some of my experiences and some of the work that we've been doing around using games, and just to share some thoughts really, and I hope it'll be of interest. It would be very helpful to know in the chat maybe what kind of experience you have, and whether you have used games in the classroom, what games you might have made use of, or challenges that you've experienced. I'll return to the chat every so often, so there are some natural kind of breaks in the presentation. So I'll return to those and just check in to see if we have any questions or comments as we go. And there'll definitely be time at the end to review those and to have a bit of a discussion after I've concluded the presentation. Most of you, I think, will know who I am, but not everybody will. So Will Thomas, I'm an associate professor in the Suffolk Business School. As you can see, I've got various kind of research interests, and like a lot of people, they change every time I write them, but ethical leadership, the ethics of care, wicked problems, so specific sorts of complex problems. And as far as my teaching experience goes, I'm a module leader in modules across levels 4 to 7. I was course leader for our undergraduate business management program with some associated routes. And I've been interested in board and card games for a long time. I love playing board and card games. And I designed a game for use in the classroom a few years ago. And that's really what I'm here to talk about, that experience, some general thoughts about using or even creating games to use in the classroom, and about some of the work we've been doing with those ideas. So let me just say a little bit more about today's session. So I want to say something about why we might use games and what they might bring to us. From there move on to pose 3 questions that I think we need to ask ourselves if we're thinking about using games in classrooms. And then share 2 examples. One is the example of the game that I created here at the University of Suffolk, and the other is an example of some work that I've been doing with the German Armed Forces Staff College, and with some colleagues there about the use of games, and then conclude with some final thoughts and a few kind of key points maybe that you might want to take away. A couple of things I'm not really talking about. One is gamified learning. So I'm not really talking about the idea of badges and rewards and points for engagement, or being involved in discussion boards, meeting certain learning goals. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I think it could be incredibly useful, but I think that probably is a slightly separated topic. Definitely though, I'm definitely considering the use of off-the-shelf games. So published board games, the sorts of things you might have kicking around in a cupboard that you might go and purchase. creating your own games or your own gamified activities, or even much shorter activities which are sort of game-like and have some of those same properties. Just going to check the chat. So Kahoot, I think, is a really good way to do this, and that's exactly what I mean by that sort of game-like activity, because that really is a good way to sort of engage students. And I know last year when we were doing that as part of our online teaching, students really loved it, and it brought out quite a fun competitive streak in students. I had one second-year student who would get quite upset if she didn't win the weekly quiz. But yeah, Lego, Play-Doh, excellent stuff. I'd love to use Uno, Aisha said. Yeah, why not? Yeah. I guess a lot of people will recognize the image. So the image is of course, the board game Monopoly. And a pop quiz for you in the chat. How many copies of Monopoly do you think have been sold worldwide? So it's been around for a pretty long time. It's been around for the best part of 100 years. How many copies have been sold worldwide? It's a really interesting game, actually, and was created by a woman, created by Lizzie Maggie, to explain single tax theory. So it was an anti-capitalist board game. So it is not about, the idea is not about being successful. It's to point out how capital replicates itself, and how the ownership of property is fundamentally unfair. Lots of great examples. Everything from 50 million from MLA right up to, what have we got? 5 billion, 6 billion, 3 billion from FE. Actually, it's more than 275 million. So it's not quite as high as everyone. Perhaps I gave it too big a build up. But still an awful lot of copies have been sold. It's a board game a lot of us will have played. And I was just thinking before we started, it's a board game that I reckon most people don't play correctly. It's one of those games where everybody's got house rules, and I suspect a lot of us don't play it according to the proper rules. Anyway, this is not a seminar on Monopoly. The university had a great seminar on Monopoly a couple of years ago by a guy called David Parlett. Why might we use board games in the classroom? This, I think, is the kind of image that a lot of us will have about board games, about them being engaging, about them being a great way to bring people together, about stimulating kind of conversation, coming together. In this case, it's an image of a family coming together, and inevitably it's Monopoly that they're playing, you know, that kind of family favorite game. And there is quite a lot of evidence to suggest that games are a great way to engage students, to motivate students to learn, to encourage them and enable them to explore ideas. And really that's the reason why I've been keen to use games in teaching, and why I think it's an interesting thing for us to have a look at. That's really what has spurred my interest in games in the classroom. This is one of the significant challenges, and really this is the kind of focus of what I want to talk about in the rest of the session. So SG in this context means serious game. Serious games must demonstrate the transfer of learning in order to be serious, whilst remaining engaging and entertaining in order to be games. So what Sylvester Arnab is suggesting and reminding us of is, if we're trying to use games in the classroom, if we want to use games in the classroom for serious purposes, in other words, this isn't the thing we do in the last session before Christmas when everyone's a bit tired and everyone's a bit worn out, and so we're just going to get together and have a good time and eat some chocolate and what have you. If we're using board games or games as part of the learning process, then we need to make sure that we are really thinking about the learning that is taking place, but also remaining engaging and entertaining. So one of the two key challenges that I'm starting with is this balance between being serious and being engaging and entertaining. Because if we're not doing both those things, then really we're falling somewhere between either it not being a good learning activity or it not being engaging and entertaining, and not really using the benefit that games are supposed to bring us. The other thing that I wanted to mention as a kind of something to be aware of is accessibility. And as with any form of learning, I think it's really important that we pay attention to ensuring that our classrooms are as accessible as they possibly can be. So I want to talk you through what this slide is. Some of you may recognize the game that is top left here. And it's a game that we're going to come back to talk about later in the session. It's actually a board game called Scythe. It came out, I think, in 2015. It has been tremendously popular. The thing that I want you to really see in that image is that it is visually quite a complicated looking game. And it's actually not very easy to see what's going on in that picture at all. Contrast that with this set of cards on the right hand side. This is a set of cards that is intended to be a resource that can be used for multiple games. So it's not a single game. It's really a sort of game resource, and you can play a dozen or so games with these cards. But these are much clearer. They're very easy to read. They're very accessible. And I find it very easy to get sidetracked by looking at websites like Meeple Like Us. And I really encourage you to take a look if you're interested in accessibility at all, not even really to do with games. I think it's a really interesting website to look at. The table here is taken from their review of the game Scythe. And you can see what they're doing here. They're looking at accessibility in lots of different ways, checking how that game works in terms of the additional needs that some players might need, or particular accessibility challenges that some players might have. And what they're not doing, they're really clear that they're not saying that games that are not accessible are not good. And similarly, the games that are accessible, that doesn't make them a good game at all. But this is a tool that we might use in order to be careful about the sort of selections that we're making. And you can see that it's a pretty mixed scoreboard for Scythe, this game here. I haven't included the one for this set of cards. It scores A's across pretty much across the board. Because it's very clear, relatively easy to use, and so on and so forth. And a lot of the accessibility with a set of cards depends on what you might do with them. A couple of other things to think about in terms of accessibility. The first thing is that not all game concepts are going to be equally familiar to all. So I'm thinking about things like card suits, for example. I've been involved in a couple of leadership programs where students who come from a range of different backgrounds and from all over the world will come together and do a variety of tasks. And one of them was about sorting traditional playing cards, and even the use of the word traditional is problematic, but the sorts of playing cards that we would use in the UK with clubs, diamonds, hearts and spades as the suits. Those are not the suits in every part of the world. Some students might come from parts of the world where they don't use playing cards, where they're used to playing cards with different suits entirely. So that is something that we really do need to think about. And the other thing that it's worth being cautious about is theme. So the theme of some games may well not sit well in our classrooms, and that's something that we might want to pay particular attention to. So a lot of board games are based around trading, and some of those are better at dealing with the sort of colonization, colonial type themes that might come out of that type of gameplay. So it's worth thinking about the theme of the game, how that might sit with students, the familiarity with concepts that you might be going to use, just as part of paying attention to accessibility issues that we might pay attention to as part of our regular preparation. Okay, so I want to move on to 3 questions that I think are really important to us. So we want to balance this idea of being serious and paying attention to what students are learning with being fun and engaging and getting all those benefits from the games that we're using. And incidentally, I think this applies equally to board games or card games, these sorts of activities, as it might do to apps or digital games, computer games. I'm just not as familiar with that world as I am with this one. The first question, and in many ways the most important question, I think, is what are you hoping to achieve? And all our choices need to be driven by a pedagogical intent. So including the fact that you're deciding to use a game at all. You know, is this activity, is the purpose of your session, or if you're spreading it over several sessions, is that something that is appropriate to be gamified? Is it appropriate to use games in that particular context? I think it's also worth thinking about why and how you're using that game. So what purpose is it intended to serve? What is its role within students' learning? And also, what game are you going to pick? And I'm going to say a little bit more about that as part of the response to the second question. Learning objectives are a great way to express what we're hoping to achieve with our students, and most of us will be very familiar with that as an approach. Whether those are learning objectives at a course level, a module level, or at session level, I would suggest it's worth thinking about those in 2 different ways. Firstly, about skills that you wish to see practiced, and secondly, about knowledge that you might wish to see reinforced. And the reason I say that is because I think it helps us to consider what sort of game we're going to use and how we're going to use it. And that's something that has been an interest of mine for a little while, in how we resolve that question. Personally, I think this is a useful tool to engage with when we're thinking about what we're trying to do with our learning, and to think about where the game might sit in our classrooms and in the students' learning journey, if you like. So most people, I guess, will be passingly familiar with the experiential learning cycle, and I'm particularly interested in the top and leftmost aspects of this. So the idea that games might help students experiment with ideas, to play around with concepts, to explore them in some way, or to give them a sense of concrete experience, particularly in concepts that are particularly abstract. So games might help us to flesh out some of this circle, particularly on topics where otherwise it would be hard for them to do so, hard for them to get that experience. And again, I'll return to this when I come to talk about the first example, because really this drove my creation of a game that I use with students, wanting to give them this opportunity to play around with and explore concepts which were otherwise pretty abstract and hard to engage with. The second question that I would suggest that we need to think about is how our choice of game fits with the goals that we've set ourselves. So we've been clear about what we're trying to achieve, what we want students to take away from their learning, and now is to think about the relationship with the game, and thinking about what makes that game suitable for its intended purpose, and how we connect the game to learning outcomes. And that's a sort of theme that I think needs to flow through the thinking about these sessions, is making that connection between the game and the learning outcomes. It's really important that students in particular are clear why they're playing this game. it doesn't come across as, I think maybe we all had at school sessions with supply teachers or someone who was filling in, and they stuck a video on, and it clearly didn't have anything to do with what we were supposed to be learning, but was a good way to keep us quiet for an hour. We definitely don't want to be giving that impression to students, and we need to make sure that they understand the relationship between the game and what it is they're supposed to be learning. I think it's helpful to think about two elements of the game. So the first is how it is played. So the sort of mechanics and mechanisms of the game and the way that those might support learning outcomes. So for example, some games will prompt discussion. They might be a really great way to encourage students to communicate and to talk to each other, maybe to increase their vocabulary, maybe to explore ideas of being clear in terms of communication or providing instructions and so on. And the second is the theme of the game. So what's the game about? What are you doing? How do the mechanisms of the game connect to that purpose and to that theme? And it's worth pointing out that not all games have a great theme. So if you think about games like backgammon or chess or poker, there is really no theme there. Some games appear to have a theme, but it's really sort of pasted on. But some games really have a very strong theme. So there is a relationship between the topic of the game and meaningful game decisions. So why you might decide to act in this particular way. They might model supply and demand issues very effectively. So the theme of the game, the trading in the game, requires and supports students to engage with concepts which will be important to us, maybe familiar to us in terms of the knowledge that we're trying to reinforce for students. So we can address knowledge goals as well as skills goals by thinking about mechanics and theme of the game. And then the third question is about implementing the game successfully. So it's really, for me, this is about how you're going to connect these learning outcomes of the game to the classroom, and that's about the students. I'm assuming we can all do that for ourselves, but communicating it to the students is a different challenge. The first thing I think is about introducing the game, and one of the things that I've discovered for myself is that the game teach, as it's called, so introducing the game and how it's played and the rules and what have you, is not easy. It requires practice, and it usually takes considerably longer than you think it's going to. It's something that needs to be very active. It really is a question of going around students, going around groups and making sure that they are playing in the way that you intended. And I think one or two people who are in the room have experience of participating in my game teach and also in playing the game, and they might recognize that idea. The length of the session that you have is also a factor in terms of the game that you choose. I started off with a game that was far too complicated and took far too long, too hard to teach, too much for students to do in the time. And so we sort of crashed into the end of the session without really having wrapped it up effectively. And that means dialing it back, of course, for future sessions. So thinking about how long you've got with students, what's practical in terms of that session. And but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't use really complicated games. And the second example will show that. Second example is a phenomenally complicated game, but one that students engage with over a very long period of time. And so that is a thoughtful choice. It's a deliberate choice. Had the game been much simpler, it really wouldn't have held students' enthusiasm and engagement for a long period of time. And the second element of this is how you support the learning and how you encourage students to reflect, to reinforce the learning and to close the loop, to finish off this part of the learning cycle. And this idea of reflection and getting students to think about the relationship between the experiences they've had with the game, and with the concepts and learning that you're hoping that they take away. And I think this is a really important element of running games successfully, is making sure that there is proper time for students to engage in reflection. Just going to pause, going to see a couple of messages in the chat, and I haven't had a chance to read them, but hi Lynette, that's all we've missed. Yeah, you're very welcome. So what I'm going to do now is talk about two examples. And the first example is a game which I created in the classroom, or for use in the classroom here. And the second example, as I said, is a complete different sort of game used in a very different setting. And I'm slightly conscious of time. I'm squinting into my desk light. I will make sure that we don't talk, or I don't talk, for more than about another 10 or 15 minutes, absolute maximum. So the game that I've created is called Persuasion. It's a card game, and it is intended to be relatively simple. So, and by that I mean, I introduce the game, I run it within a single session of the module, or I have actually also used it as a sort of taster session or a session for schools. It works really well for year 12, year 13 students as well. So within a couple of hours, the whole session can run. So the situation, more or less, will be familiar to a lot of you. So very early in level 4, the first year of undergraduate study, the student group is still forming. We're still building confidence for a lot of students. We're trying to encourage them to participate, to be willing to share ideas, to test things out, maybe to get things wrong in a safe way. And we're dealing with an abstract topic. We're dealing with a topic around ways in which managers might motivate staff. You know, what can they do in order to get staff to behave in the way that they want them to behave. And having taught this module and versions of this module for a few years, my experience is that's quite a tough thing for students to engage with. They struggle with that because it is relatively abstract. So I wanted to do something which provided a way for them to have some fun, but also to engage with some of the concepts that we were talking about. And this is what I created. What you're looking at here is a sort of computer-generated image of the original game cards. They look much, much better on here than they did in real life. In real life, they started as cut-out pieces of paper. That didn't work very well because they weren't robust enough. And the second stage was to put them in what are called card sleeves. So they're like little Polly Pockets. You can put a playing card at the back and the piece of paper at the front, and they're more robust, and you can reuse them. That worked fairly well. The gameplay itself is fairly easy, fairly straightforward. You compare characteristics of a manager character that you create with the task that you're trying to get your employees to do. So here are some of the tasks on the screen here. Some of the tasks are harder to get your staff to do than others. And so the idea is that we're exploring why managers might be able to get people to do some tasks and not others, why managers might become more persuasive over a period of time. And we build around this some structured reflection. So there are accompanying kind of worksheets for them to discuss in groups and then to share back, that connect the gameplay and connect the theme to some theoretical ideas. So ideas of power and of forms of power, of the role that reflection has in terms of becoming more effective as a manager. And in the second stage of the game, we add a little bit of complexity and some new features. So we discuss the role of kind of departments and trying to influence people outside your department structure, for example. It's worked pretty well, not perfectly by any stretch of the imagination. But as I said earlier, one of the things I found was gameplay was too complicated to start off with. It was even more complicated than we've got here in the first couple of iterations, and I had to dial back my ambition a little bit. And in the second stage of development, we were able to improve the cards. So I had some money from Kelt a couple of years ago to work with a designer to create some new resources and to have them printed. So now these are properly, professionally designed, professionally printed cards. They look and feel like playing cards that you might be used to. Excuse me. Simplified the gameplay, reduced the rule set a little bit. The improved resources, now we have had the opportunity to play with them with students this year. They work very much better. And we now have a couple of different sessions, or I've got a couple of different sessions. So I can run a sort of a slightly shorter abbreviated session or a slightly longer session. And we've got good feedback, positive sessions with schools, positive sessions with students. And it seems to be a game that is working. One of the things that I'd really like to do more of is more playtesting of this game, including getting more detailed and sort of robust feedback. Unfortunately, you know, this is a game intended to be delivered physically in person, and the last couple of years have been pretty tough for that. So I was very happy to be able to run it with students this year, and I think they enjoyed it too. Apologies for my dining room table in the background of this picture. I took a paper based on the creation of this game to a conference in September 2020, the European Conference on Games-Based Learning. And what we got here is a summary of the session learning outcomes on the left-handmost column. And then in the right-handmost column, some summary information. So content or skills is a reflection of the type of learning objective that we had. So 4 content-based learning objectives and 3 that were around skills that I was looking for students to develop. And then a reflection of whether this is reinforced by the mechanics of the game, the theme of the game, or by the discussion that occurs. Realistically, you could write discussion in every single one of these boxes, but this was a way just to communicate in terms of the conference where that intended learning was taking place and the relationship between the learning outcomes and the choice of game, the creation of the game, the mechanics, and its theme. And whilst it's not particularly complicated, it is quite thematic, and it's surprising how students get into it, and they do seem to have positive experiences from playing the game. So there is something of a framework here, and the paper that I presented at the conference outlined a framework which I intended to be useful for educators thinking about what sorts of games they might play and how they might approach running those games. And at this conference, I got talking to a colleague called Thorsten Kadala, who is an Oberstleutnant at the Staff College of the German Armed Forces. And we got talking about his work with board games in his classroom. And he is responsible for teaching a seminar called The Gamification of Strategic Thinking. There is a very long history of games being used in an extremely serious manner in the development of strategic thinking, security, policy, and military strategy. So wargaming, essentially. And Torsten's done a lot of work on this, including with NATO. He trains German officers. So this is a sort of Sandhurst equivalent in Germany. And he runs a session that is intended to support students' development of planning, project management, security policy, and a whole host of transferable skills. So these are things like the OODA loop, which might be familiar to some people: observation, orientation, decision, and action. Notions of deterrence as a formal concept, and of security policy. So getting students to think about the DIME model of security policy, diplomacy, information, military, and economics. And he decided 2 years ago to start using the board game Scythe. So this is the game, if you remember back to 20 minutes ago, we were looking at in terms of accessibility. Torsten's been using Scythe because it is highly complicated. It is an extremely complicated game to get into. It has quite a steep learning curve. It is highly strategic. It is a war game set in an alternative history in about the 1920s. And the way that he runs this is by encouraging or putting students into teams that are then responsible for developing their own skills in the run-up to a competition that runs at the end of the module. So there is a wargaming competition that students are preparing for. He runs the as 6 two-week sprints, so in a project management sense, during which students are applying agile project management techniques. So they're learning about project management, they're taking it in turns to lead their teams, they're being given specific tasks, they gain an understanding of tactics, learn the game as they play, but are also learning about techniques and tools that they can learn and take from the game out into their roles in the armed forces. And it's also worth saying that he has students who are in other uniformed services, and actually also, interestingly, last year in some public sector roles as well. The conclusion with a competition between the various teams is in the sort of finest traditions of wargaming kind of development and military teaching approaches, I guess you would say. What we got here is an example from the digital version that they're using. Obviously, in the last year, like everyone else, Torsten was unable to conduct his seminar face-to-face. Luckily, Scythe has an excellent digital version, so an app that you can use on iPads and so on. So students were able to play the game in that way and to develop their techniques in that form. If you've not played Scythe and it sounds like your sort of thing, I would encourage you to do so. It is tricky to get into, though, I would say that. In the run-up to the 2021 European Conference on Games-Based Learning, which happened in September of this year, I worked with Torsten to think about the evaluation of his seminar. And we started by thinking about the learning objectives that his students would have. This is a summary of them. He actually had many more than this, and that probably too many to address fully. But what I've tried to do is to capture content-based learning objectives. So in other words, some of these concepts around project management, security policy, and so on. So in the top 3 rows there. And then a single learning objective that really captures some of this transferable skills stuff. So he uses a 4C model for transferable skills: communication, collaboration, creativity, and critical thinking. What we found, despite the fact that it was a small group of students, and with all the caveats that that would bring, we found that actually his implementation was extremely successful. In all of these learning objectives, the students report being more confident and feeling more skilled in all these areas. And they also report, when we asked them about the game and about the implementation of the game, they reported to us that that had worked for them too. So they were able to draw connections between the game and the learning that was taking place, but also what they were doing in the seminar and their day-to-day roles, or their developing skills as military officers. So it gave us a lot of confidence that this way of thinking about how to use games and this way of thinking about how to evaluate their use in the classroom was beneficial. And we have a sort of summary paper that is being prepared for a simulation and gaming journal, which hopefully we will get out in early part of the new year. Just to wrap up, sorry, this is a slide I should have shown, of course. Just to wrap up, thinking about what happens next. Well, Persuasion, so my own game, is something that I'm really keen to keep developing. I think it's a very useful tool for us and something which can be developed in a number of different ways. I saw that Effie was here earlier. Effie and I have been talking about thinking about how we might use this approach to evaluate her use of a tool called SimVenture, which is an entrepreneurship simulator as part of the module she runs with our first year students. I intend to do some more formalized work with the German Armed Forces Staff College, and to develop this framework as a tool that we might use in terms of evaluation and to support decision making and choice in the classroom. And that's something that I appreciate thoughts on how we might do, really, because I've sort of come stuck slightly in my thinking around that. So as a way to finish, I said to Aisha that I'd offer us three takeaways, three ideas. The first one, and I'm really clear that the choice of game has to be made with purpose. You can't bring a game to the classroom without being really clear what the learning is going to be. And that needs to be clear to everybody, including to our students. I was thinking back to when I last talked about this, was a session after a session, I should say, that was presented by Alexandra Mihai at the Learning and Teaching Day in the summer, where she was talking about intentional design. And that is an idea that I think really struck me, that we have to make these decisions with intent. So that choice of game is absolutely crucial. The second thing that I'd encourage you to think about is how to build in time for structured reflection. Connecting the game to learning objectives, reinforcing the learning for students, ensuring that they're able to complete that experiential learning cycle. All of that, I think, requires that there is proper structured reflection built in for students and that we're helping them through that process. And the third thing to take away is that more complex does not equal better. Using games in the classroom is going to take longer than you think it will. So therefore, I would encourage you to only do as much as is necessary, or as much as is going to continue to add value. So to be a bit cautious about introducing more and more new ideas. I hope that was interesting. I can see there are a few comments in the chat. Delighted to take questions or comments. I think the easiest way to do that is to stick them in the chat, and then we can have a go at responding or answering them. David, oh, sorry, I'm taking these out of order, I think, but David said, do you still have that supply chain game that used to be in the third floor office? I'd like to use it for a block 4 module. The short answer, David, is yes, we do. The long answer is yes, we do, but I'm not entirely sure where it is, given the fact that everything in the third floor went into boxes about 6 weeks ago. But we do absolutely have it, and that has loads of online materials. So if you haven't checked the website out, I'd really encourage you to do that, because they have lesson plans and worksheets and all manner of things there to work with. And the game is called Business on the Move. So if you Google that, you will come across their website. Effie, yeah, good question. If you're looking to use games and enterprise modules, what repository or resource would you suggest we look up? There are, I think, a couple of really good resources, including databases of games that are listed by sort of complexity and by mechanics and things like that. I think if you can be really clear what you want to do with the game, then that's a great place to start. The other thing is to look towards the work of people like Sebastian Arnab, who I referenced earlier. His group, I think he's still at Coventry, his group does quite a lot of research and sort of publishes work in that area. So that might be something that you could look towards. The online website, Effie, that I was talking about, is called Board Game Geek. And they have a way to search games by mechanic, complexity, player count, and so on and so forth. It is a rabbit hole down which it is extremely enjoyable to fall. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Aisha. I think it'd be really interesting. A couple of people talked about things like Lego and Play-Doh, and Aisha talked about Uno. You know, when time and circumstances allow, I think it'd be interesting to get together and talk about how we might use those things and make use of them in classrooms. I think there are lots of interesting things we might do, and of course, Lego has specifically been used quite a lot in education, and there's quite a lot of resource around that. Without wishing to get into a discussion about whether Lego is a game. We're very fortunate, I should say, that we're really fortunate to have a visiting senior fellow or professor, David Parlett, who was the guy who gave a talk on Monopoly a couple of years ago. He's associated with the university, I think, through the computer games design team. And he's an extremely well-known game designer, and he has collated a resource of card games and card game rules, and was the first person to win one of the big annual board game design prizes back in the 1970s. So he's someone who I think might be a really useful resource for us around this, and probably someone we could reach out to. It's 5 o'clock on a Wednesday, Aisha. I think that's what we're done for.
I think that's I think it's been fantastic, Will. Really great. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
It's brilliant. So thank you everyone for your questions and your comments. Just want to pass my thanks on to Will for today's session. And yes, the recording will be uploaded onto YouTube for anyone that has missed it or knows of colleagues that have missed this session and want to watch it. So yeah, thanks again, Will. I really appreciate that. And just the comments and chat saying thank you. It's been really good.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Aisha.
Okay, thanks, guys. Bye.
Cheers.